say I think we should get started.
Okay.
Jacob, since we're a small group, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sure.
I feel like we mostly know who you are anyway, but if you want to just sort of incorporate that into your presentation.
Yeah, so my name is Jacob Bloom. I am an architecture associate at Cambridge 7 outside of Harvard Square. And I'm a Living Future ambassador, so I give presentations on all of their programs. And Lee and Tori have already seen some of this, so there'll be some reiteration of what you already know, but hopefully we'll get a little bit deeper into a bunch of it. So I'm just into the chat. I just dropped a sign-in sheet just so I can keep track. So if you guys can fill that out, I think Tori and Lee already filled it out once. So cool. So here, let me share my screen. We'll jump in. That one. Okay.
Should say, okay.
We need editing access to the document.
Oh, did I turned that off? Hold on a second.
And this is Green and Open Somerville, who is hosting Jacob
Yep.
Bloom's talk tonight. And for anyone who will be watching the recording in the future, thank you. And if you're a developer, thank you for listening in and doing what you can do to live up to this challenge and be a leader in Somerville.
Okay. All good? The presentation today is the Living Building Challenge, a visionary path to a regenerative future. Before I jump in, I would like to pay respect to the land that I'm presenting from that we're talking about today, the traditional land of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts tribes. And I pay respect to the tribal elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Jacob Bloom. As I already said, I'm a Living Future ambassador, so I give presentations on all of the International Living Future Institute's programs. The International Living Future Institute, sorry, I'm trying to move my Zoom window out of the way so I can see what's going on. The International Living Future Institute is a global NGO nonprofit based out of Seattle with about 40 staff working around the world. The mission of the ILFI is to catalyze a transformation towards communities that are culturally rich, socially just, and ecologically restorative. So that sounds, pretty good goal. Today we're going to talk about what that actually means and how we go about accomplishing that. So really the fundamental question that they ask in how we do this is, what does good look like? We have a lot of programs out there that are looking at how we do 50% better or 70% better or 90% better. But what if we stop setting the bar compared to what it was in 2006 and we start saying, what if the goal isn't to just do better? What if it's to do good? So I know Tori and Lee have been through this once, but since we're a small group, feel free to jump in. What does good look like? How do we build buildings that are actually good for the ecosystem, good for society, good for our culture? I can't hear you, Tori.
Giant tree houses. We make buildings from living things.
Buildings from living things. And so why is that good? Let's dig into that. Why are building from living things, why would that be good?
It would be good because something that's alive has an energetic soul. Sometimes, also you could say that for non necessarily energetic things, but it's actually you're living with another creature. And you're being able to be in the presence of nature, which is going to be, and this living organic creature is going to be breathing. It's going to be pouring out its oxygen and breathing in the carbon dioxide. And when you're in a living area, you feel more alive.
Yeah. So right. So yes, it's cleaning the air. It's generating oxygen for us to breathe. It's pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. We also, like you, I mean, there are a lot of scientific studies, not just like, you know, intuitively we have this response that being around trees and living things makes us feel better, but there's a lot of scientific research that says that's real, that there's a lot of benefits to our health, to our productivity, to it reduces crime, right? Like all these things that come out of being around nature. So, okay, any other answers out there? What does good look like? How do we make good buildings?
I think buildings that, I mean, inevitably other plants and animals are going to be displaced, but one that acknowledges and tries to provide habitat for as many as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the ILFI's approach to this was their first program that they came out with, which was the Living Building Challenge. And that was their response into what does a building that does good for the ecosystem and our society look like? And so stepping out just a second, the ILFI sort of has three prongs to their approach, right? They've got a philosophy, which is the ideas, the seeds that we're spreading about how we can build better. They have advocacy, which is how do we create an environment for those ideas to grow? Right? We know that there are a lot of barriers out there. Some of them are financial. Some of them are policy based. That there are some building codes that make some of these things that we're going after challenging, and some of them are just about what's available in the market. Right? That we want to build buildings that are healthy for people, and that it means using materials that aren't toxic. And there are some things that we need to build with that no one makes that aren't toxic yet. And so we want to try and advocate for more materials that will, you know, fulfill our needs from a building standpoint and be healthy at the same time. So that's the advocacy component. And then the last component is certification, which is how we recognize that we've accomplished what we set out to do. So the philosophy behind the Living Building Challenge and the ILFI as a whole is to come up with a holistic approach to sustainability. It's not just about reducing our energy usage or reducing our water usage. We're trying to look at the whole picture, that it's about creating buildings that are equitable. It's about creating buildings that are beautiful, because when we build things that are beautiful, they last longer. People take better care of them. And from an ecological standpoint, for the environment, for greenhouse gas emissions, the best thing we can do is make buildings that last a long time, because if we have to rebuild them, that's a whole lot of waste and a whole lot of energy that goes into that. And so we'd rather just keep them around longer. Another aspect of this is that we're looking at performance of buildings, not our energy models or estimates of how the building will perform, but we're actually coming back after the building is complete and we're measuring it for a full 12 months to make sure that it's performing the way that it's supposed to. That when we say that we're net zero or net positive energy, we're actually hitting that goal. And then from all of these projects that are going through this certification, there's a feedback loop back towards the ILFI where they take the information of how those projects went for those project teams and use it to update the standard for the next version. So right now we're on version 4, and version 4 has learned from everything that the previous projects have gone through to try and make the process as smooth as possible while still hitting the high targets that we're after. And so when it comes to answering this question of what does good look like for a building, ILFI turns to this metaphor of a flower, right? And the idea of the flower is that it's rooted in place, it's inherently of its environment, it's adapted to its ecosystem, It harvests its energy and its water from the site, right? Energy comes from the sun and the ground. Water comes from the rain and the groundwater. It's pulling its nutrients from the ground. It's building itself. It's cleaning the air. It's cleaning the water. And it's beautiful. It's helping create a healthier environment for the people around it. The people around it are able to appreciate its beauty and, you know, its smell, its taste, right? There are all these things that it gives back to people. And then at the end of its life, it turns back into nutrients and it feeds back into the ecosystem. And it's all part of this closed loop that is creating no waste and drawing no extra resources that it's not then returning back into the ecosystem. So from that idea, the Living Building Challenge came up with 7 petals. And those 7 petals are place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity and beauty, equity and inclusion, and beauty and biophilia. So just to look at ILFI a little bit more comprehensively, the Living Building Challenge, what we're talking about today, is the first program that came out of ILFI back in 2006, but they have 9 programs that are out there right now. So the top 3 you see here are their transparency labels. So Declare, we'll talk more about later. And it's basically a materials ingredients list for building products or any product really. Just is a social justice transparency label for organizations to showcase how the equity and stewardship is within their organization. And Reveal is a transparency label for buildings to showcase how energy efficient they are. From a certification standpoint, they have 3 certifications, which are their zero energy certification, their zero carbon certification. I'll touch on that a little bit more as it relates to Somerville, and their core green building certification, which I'll also touch on because it sort of ties into some of the Living Building Challenge aspects as well. And then at the bottom, we've got our 3 challenges, and these are really the peak programs from ILFI. And so the Living Building Challenge is the primary one we're here to talk about today. Taking those same 7 petals and goals, they have the Living Product Challenge, which applies those same petals to products and materials. And they have a living Community Challenge, which takes the ideas of the Living Building Challenge and starts to look at how those might scale up to a whole community, a neighborhood, a campus. What does it mean to take these ideas about doing good and expand them out to a broader footprint? Right? And so why would you do this, right? What is the value that you're getting out of going through this program? And really there are a few aspects. One is that you're getting third-party verification that your building is performing to the highest level possible, right? That it's not just good on paper, it's good in reality. We're coming back, we're measuring how it's performing and making sure that it's accomplishing what it set out to do and that you're getting what you paid for. Industry recognition, right? The Living Building Challenge is one of the highest regarded green building certifications out there in the market, if not the highest regarded. It's very challenging, right? These things that we're talking about today are not easy, but they have a lot of value, both to the ecosystem, our society, and financially, right? And that's something that this is the Bullitt Center in Seattle that you're looking at. And this was one of the first fully living certified buildings. And here's the CEO recognizing that you can't just build a building if it doesn't make financial sense, but you can make it make financial sense. And part of that is through energy savings and water savings. But the bigger aspect is about the people, right? That when an organization is working, they're spending about 100 times more on salaries than they are on utilities. And so if you can create an environment that's keeping people healthier, that's helping them work more productively, that's helping people take fewer sick days because they enjoy being in the office because it's a healthy environment. You know, if you can increase productivity 1%, that's offset your entire utility cost for the year. And we're talking about some things today that could increase productivity by 10 to 15%. And so we need to help developers understand how they can market that to tenants, because there's a lot of value there and tenants are starting to realize that. And this is basically what I just talked about, that of all the programs out there, Living Building Challenges really places a heavy value on the health of building occupants and the equity of building occupants. And also from a industry recognition standpoint, this is something that comes back to, right? And you see it with a lot of the big tech firms, right? Firms like Microsoft, which has pledged to offset their entire historical carbon footprint, I think by 2030 or 2040. Google, that just built their new London headquarters to meet the Living Building Challenge standard. So these are things that partly it's for their employees, partly it's also because their reputation is helped by the fact that they're committing to these high standards. So jumping into the actual Living Building Challenge. The Living Building Challenge is made up of 20 imperatives, which are within those 7 petals that we talked about before. Recognizing that so to be fully living certified, a project must meet all 20 imperatives. Recognizing that it may be difficult to meet all 20 imperatives, the Institute has come up with some other ways of sort of building up to that point. So they've picked 10 imperatives that they consider to be the most critical. Those are the core imperatives. And so all projects seeking certification must meet all 10 core imperatives. And we'll talk about those as we go through them. Once you've met those 10 core imperatives, that qualifies for the core green building certification that we looked at on that slide with all the different programs. So that's a really good starting point for what a sustainable building can be. And even the core building certification is still probably a little bit more aggressive than LEED Platinum right now. So it's still a really high standard, still something you can be really proud of doing, but it's easier than going for all 20 imperatives. Once you hit all 10 of those core imperatives, you can continue on and you can certify the water, energy, or materials petal, along with other petals as well. And they have, within the challenge, 4 different typologies, and the requirements for these 4 typologies are going to vary a little bit, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for an interiors project to be focused on how the landscape is performing, or it doesn't make sense for a landscape project to be focused on the indoor air quality because it doesn't have any. So some of these things will come across, but some of them vary, and some of them have different standards depending on the typology. So the expected energy reduction for the core imperative for new buildings is going to be higher than it is for existing buildings, because the Institute recognizes that you have a different starting point. And so these are the 7 petals that I mentioned earlier: place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity, and beauty. And so then within these, we have our 20 imperatives. And now we'll sort of walk through each of them. Because this is Green and Open Somerville, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the place petal than I normally would. So these ones with the little green circles next to them are the core imperatives. So those are the ones that all projects seeking certification must meet. And if you meet all 10 of those core imperatives, you can get the core green building certification. So the first one is the ecology of place imperative. And the ecology of place imperative is really about looking at the local context and environment and how you fit into that. So you need to study what the local community needs, how your building can give back to that community, and also what the local ecosystem needs and how you can give back to the ecosystem. And so project teams have to develop a pre-development reference habitat. hopefully there's a reference habitat that they can go and look at nearby that's still somewhat pristine wilderness. But if not, there are other ways of going about it. But the goal is to develop that reference habitat and look at the site as it stands today and come up with some metrics that you can reference how you are working back towards that reference habitat at project completion. The other core imperative under the place pedal is the human scaled living. And this is where all of the requirements for things like access to public transport, bicycle storage, EV charging, those sorts of things would be. And then we have the two other place imperatives that are not required for core certification, but are required to certify the place pedal. So the first one is urban agriculture. And the urban agriculture imperative is really focused on how we can bring agriculture back into our cities and connect people with the way their food is grown. And so it requires that a certain percentage of the site be devoted to food production. And for Somerville, based on, and this varies depending on the type of site, whether it's in an urban center or, you know, rural farmland, has different levels that they're expecting. But for Somerville, it's going to be 10% of your site area that is devoted to agricultural production. Or there's an alternate where you can provide 5% of your site area and then also host a weekly farmers market or some other event where local produce can be sold to the community.
Hey, Jacob,
yeah.
When you say site area, do you mean like footprint of a building or?
No, I mean the project site. And that may not be the property line. It would be whatever is considered the boundary of the project for the Living Building Challenge. And so the project team can sort of draw that boundary as makes sense. I would say most of the time it probably is at the property line. It's also important to recognize that the urban agriculture imperative and that site area does not necessarily need to be at the ground level, right? It can be up on top of a building. Yeah. And so, especially for zero lot line buildings, it's all going to have to be up on top of the building. And there are organizations that are basically focusing their organization up around doing this. So there's a company out of New York called Brooklyn Grange that has their entire organization just goes to mostly industrial buildings, but some commercial buildings, and puts farms on the roofs. So they have a farm on the roof of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And it is a pretty spectacular wedding venue. So I think we need to help developers recognize that the roof is not just wasted space, that's valuable real estate. And if we can connect developers with the right folks who want to use that space, it can be a beneficial situation for everyone, where the developer is getting extra real estate with no increase to their FAR, no increase to their building height because it's a roof. And at the same time, the community is getting less heat island effect, agricultural production on site, community jobs, right? There's a lot of benefits there. So that's something that's really big within the Living Community Challenge, is how can we start to recognize all these components to be used for more than one thing, right? That the roof is not just for keeping water out of your building, it's also for generating energy from solar or generating food through agriculture. How can roads be more than just about moving cars, right? How can we use them to connect people with the environment and clean our air, reduce the amount of heat in our cities, right? How can we go about this? And so that's something that's more part of the Living Community Challenge, where streets are part of the project site, right? When you're looking at individual buildings, streets are not really part of it. And then the last one, in the place pedal, is the habitat exchange imperative. And that one's pretty straightforward. It basically says that your site area, the building owner needs to purchase from a certified land trust an area equivalent to the property as part of a preserved habitat, so that we are ensuring that even though we're taking this, this site and we're building on it, we're making sure that we're setting aside an equal area for the ecosystem to continue to grow where it is still pristine. I should also mention, as part of the ecology of place pedal or imperative, which is a core imperative, you are not allowed to develop on any pristine wilderness sites, with very few exceptions, which is basically just if you're doing like a nature center, information center sort of thing, would be the only way that you would be able to build on a pristine wilderness site. So the habitat exchange is just about offsetting your site in a certified land trust to be preserved for the ecosystem that's there. And so
I have 2 questions.
yeah.
One is about the habitat exchange. I love that idea. But in a place like Somerville, where we just don't have any, forget pristine, it's hard to say we have any even wild air. I mean, a few wild areas.
Yeah.
We're never going to get any that would even offset a few different buildings. So
Yeah.
how do you deal with that?
So habitat exchange, obviously the preference is for it to be local. There's not a requirement for it to be local. And so, within Massachusetts, there are areas that you could find certified land trusts to preserve areas of Massachusetts that are still wild. But the developer also would have the option of donating into, ILFI has a certified land trust, or has I don't think they're the certified land trust. They have a fund that you can pay into, and once a year they pool all the funds that have come into it and they purchase from a certified land trust somewhere in the world where they think it is most valuable. I think
Gotcha.
last time it was in Australia or something like that. So it's not local.
Sure.
Local would be the preference, but it's not a requirement because of that.
Yeah. My other question is back to the talking about the roofs. I know so often the argument we hear, especially on lab buildings, is that the mechanicals are going to take up so much space. There's hardly any space left, and then you need it for amenity space. And so there's got to be a workaround, even if it's maybe putting another layer on, right? But like, do you have a nice way to respond to that?
So it depends on the project. For lab buildings, you are going to have more mechanical equipment, and that mechanical equipment, you may need more clearance around it depending on what's coming out of it. But the other aspect is, the taller your building is, the smaller the roof footprint is compared to the rest of the building, and the more of the roof gets taken up. But I think there are ways of scaling it, right? It doesn't have to be a full-fledged farm on the roof. You could add another layer. Parts of the roof are likely to be enclosed, right? Sometimes you have rooftop mechanical equipment, but sometimes you have mechanical equipment inside a roof penthouse that has a roof on top of it that could also potentially be used. But that's a challenge that I think you'd have to look at somewhat case by case, and with the project engineers, to see how that can be accommodated. And when you look at the projects that are doing it, right, even like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, like there's a farm, and sticking up out of the middle of the farm, there's big air handling units, and they just work around it. But when the air handling units are taking up the entire roof, that is a different challenge. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing, so again, the way this also could scale up, if you start talking about the living community challenge, is you have designated areas that start to work as the food production for the whole neighborhood, right? And so you look at projects like the Beacon Food Forest out of Seattle, where it's just a park, and it's a park that's based on permaculture, agriculture, and they have a couple staff that maintain it, but for the most part, it's designed to maintain itself. And anyone from the community can just walk through, and if an artichoke is ripe, they can just pick an artichoke. And so that can scale up that way. Also looking at the Living Community Challenge and how this scales up a little bit, right? So this is a picture of First Hill in Seattle. And this is an area that is in the process of going through the visioning phase of their Living Community Challenge. Living Community Challenge has a lot longer duration than the Living Building Challenge, because it takes a lot longer to build a neighborhood than a building. So they have different phases. So this is in the first phase. But looking at this street that's basically 60 feet of asphalt, right? It's got 2 lanes of travel and a lane for turns in the middle and parking on each side. And it's got trees along the edge, which is nice. But as part of their visioning plan and how they could help rewild the city, right? How can we bring nature back and give residents access to, even if it's not pristine wilderness again, that is good for their health, it's good for the environment within the city, it's good for the air, it's good for our water management, right? And they came up with turning that same street into this instead, where you've got runoff or bioswale type wetlands along the edge to take up water because it's Seattle and there's a lot of water. They've got some area that could be used for agriculture. They've still got 2 lanes of traffic, but they've pushed their parking elsewhere and dedicated more area to green space and micro vehicles and self-mobility. Sorry, before I go on, any other questions about the place pedal? Cool. So I'll keep going.
Actually, sorry, I do.
Yeah.
Am I on there too? Okay. Sorry, I'm just in the same room as Bill, so I want to make sure, even though I'm hearing myself on the television, that I'm not echoing because you're recording. Anyways, I actually was just curious, going back to you mentioned the rooftop penthouses. I don't know if you can speak to any examples in which those rooftop penthouses were actually deliberately incorporated in, like they weren't going to exist and then groups did them because they could incorporate more green on the roofs. I mean, I guess I'm even envisioning like, wow, like if that was a rooftop penthouse that had a slight slope to it and then the water could come down onto the green roof. I don't know. I'm just curious when you talk about that with the rooftop penthouse.
So
any more information.
So typically, so I don't have any specific examples. From what I've seen, most projects, the penthouse would be based on what type of equipment would need to be in it. Depending on the equipment, some equipment needs to be inside, some of it needs to be outside so that you can get enough ventilation around it. From a water standpoint, pretty much any mechanical penthouse that's on a roof is going to be taking that water and they're going to be doing something with it. Whether that's going down into the stormwater system in the street or going into some sort of rainwater collection tank or just running down into a green space that's nearby where it can water the plants, depends on the project. But that water is going to be being used for something because it can't just stay there. So I don't know of any projects that specifically like increase the size of their penthouse to put something on the roof. There are projects that put not agriculture, but solar panels over a bunch of the mechanical equipment, and the mechanical equipment basically exhausts between the panels. But I don't know of any that expanded the penthouse for the sake of creating more roof space, because most developers, for the most part, view the roof as, just something to keep the water out. It's not considered real estate. It's not considered valuable. There are building codes about how big the penthouse can be before it's no longer considered a penthouse and would start to contribute to their building height and FAR. So that gets a little bit more complicated too. But that's a separate discussion. So the water pedal is the second pedal. And so there are 2 imperatives in this pedal. One is the core imperative and the other is the imperative to accomplish the entire pedal. So the core imperative is called the responsible water use. And the responsible water use imperative says that for new construction, you need to use 0 potable water for irrigation, and that the remaining water uses of the building need to reduce potable water use by 50%. And that's 30% for existing buildings, but it's 50% for new construction. So the 0 water for irrigation means that you're going to be using some more, either you have no no irrigation on site, you have no plants, in which case you can't get pedal certified, or you can't get any certification because you won't meet the agriculture requirement, or any number of other requirements. But so you're going to need some sort of rainwater capture. The 50% of your other uses being reduced is not quite doable with low flow water fixtures. You can probably come close, but you probably are going to need some amount of non-potable water for things like toilet flushing, because the wonderful thing about toilets is that no one drinks the water. So there's no reason to put potable water in your toilets. The net positive water takes this and scale. Oh, sorry. One more thing on the responsible water use is it says that all stormwater needs to be handled on site. So you need a way to infiltrate all your water on site so it's not going into the municipal sewer system. Net positive water steps this up further and says that all of your water on site needs to be collected from the site, either from rainwater or groundwater, needs to be cleaned on site, used, treated and cleaned, and then re-infiltrated into the ground. So you are getting zero water from the municipal water system, and you are putting zero water into the municipal storm or sewer system. And that's a big one. And that one is definitely a challenge from the policy standpoint, because generating potable water on site is hard. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Generating potable water on site is not hard. The policy side of it is hard because the code does not really appreciate people generating their own water on site, or because of health standards, and that all makes sense. But that is the biggest challenge of that pedal. So so there are a couple ways that projects have gone about this. From one of the biggest things is that projects going for the water pedal almost always use composting toilets. And that goes for if it's a single story building or a high rise. The Bullitt Center that we looked at on a previous slide is a 5-story building, and it has composting toilets that stack up all the way through the building on every floor. And it goes down into an industrial composter in the basement that then gets sold as compost. And that reduces their need for water on site, but it also reduces their need for waste treatment, because part of that pedal is that you're treating all of your water on site and then you're re-infiltrating it, which means that all of your black water needs to be treated on site so that it can be infiltrated into the groundwater. So composting toilets make that a lot easier. There's also a project I know of that's going up right now in Portland, Oregon. That's a 5 to 7 story office building, and they're using composting vacuum flush toilets to accomplish this pedal. So, I think when people hear about composting toilets, they have this idea that it's like, goes into a drum in the backyard and you go and you crank it every day and stuff. And that's just not what they are anymore. The Santa Monica City Hall now has composting toilets as well. So this is something that's really come a long way, and I think we're going to see more and more of as water becomes a bigger and bigger issue.
Jacob.
Yeah.
What do you have any local examples, or at least Massachusetts examples, on the net potable water on site, specific projects or like jurisdictions, towns you've worked in, and what the experience has been? Has there been blowback? I mean, even like at the state level, the DEP, I think, in my experience, often has issues. They sometimes discourage, pumping water out of the ground anyway on a lot of sites that could do that. I'm just curious if you have any experience at Cambridge 7 yet, or yourself with the on-site potable water generation.
I don't. I will say, from hearing about not Massachusetts specific cases, but there are definitely cases where essentially in order to produce your own potable water on site, it requires essentially the building to get certified as its own municipal water supply. And as part of that, it needs to go through all of the same routine testing and disclosures, right? They have to issue quarterly reports about the water cleanliness, and so there is a big challenge there, right? To certify yourself as a municipal water supply, basically, just to be able to provide potable water on site. I don't know of any projects in Massachusetts that are generating their own potable water on site. But I can look more into that. I don't know of any off the top of my head, though.
Yeah, I just got to believe in this state, that's going to be a huge set of hurdles.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the way that the state plumbing code is written, it is not conducive to, I mean, frankly, it's not real conducive to non-potable water use for non-potable uses, but it's doable. There are, you know, using non-potable water for toilet flushing is even that, right? No one drinks toilet water. I think we all understand that if you drink toilet water, it's likely to have contaminants in it, regardless of how clean the water was going in. But even that, right, there are challenges in getting that approved in Massachusetts, but it's doable. The same goes for irrigation, right? Using rainwater to water plants on a commercial scale also requires some amount of regulatory, you know, workings to make that happen. So it's a challenge in Massachusetts and frankly everywhere.
So in the water challenge, do you need to earn the pedal? Do you need not to be hooked up to the town
So
water?
typically projects are attached, and there is basically a big valve somewhere that's closed. And so should a situation arise where they need to be attached, they can, but predominantly that valve is closed and they are not. I will also say, so the water pedal also has something that's not included on this side with the Institute called scale jumping, which basically says that recognizing that, you know, especially for high-rise buildings, collecting enough water on site to do everything could be a challenge because your roof area is fairly small to the size to the square footage of your building. So scale jumping says that you can basically expand to the neighborhood, right? Similar to the Living Community Challenge, and you can start to pool your resources amongst the neighborhood. So for example, Boynton Yards has a giant cistern that's collecting all the rainwater from the site. And that cistern is a detention cistern. So it's basically just holding it for a while before it then sends it off to the Charles River again. But we could take all the water that's going to that cistern and use it to flush all the toilets in all of the buildings, right? Rather than sending it to the Charles River. So that's the idea of scale jumping, which also will help with the ability to provide enough water so that you don't have to open that valve on occasion to get enough water because you have enough. The water pedal also requires, I think, 1 week's worth of resiliency. That basically, yeah, so the project for the full net positive water, you need to be able to store 1 week's worth of drinking water on site. So obviously for different project types, what 1 week's worth of drinking water is going to vary dramatically, right? For an office building, you have a lot less drinking water than for a residential building. But then you get into some projects that, like, say, a school where maybe you wouldn't typically have a lot of drinking water, but should you encounter a situation where you're in resiliency mode, that could become a fallout shelter. And all of a sudden 1 week's worth of drinking water could be huge because you could be accommodating way more people than what it would typically hold. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack, but that's the idea behind the water pedal, is that we're taking load off of the municipal water system by not taking water from the municipal water system, and we're taking load off of the municipal sewer system because we're handling everything on site, is the overall goal of the water pedal.
it's those underground water tanks are like in so many places. There's one under Lincoln Park. There's going to be one under Conway, one under every building, I think, in Union Square.
Yeah. So,
and it's,
yeah.
It just seems such a waste. It's like, we're going to be in drought and we're going to be like,
Right.
you know, the opportunity, we'll be sitting
and now
on
is
water.
the time. And so I will say, you know, as these buildings are going up, the biggest reason that developers are not using that water for non-potable uses right now is that it means that they need to install essentially a second set of supply piping to all their toilets, because you need a second set of pipes to run your non-potable water through the building than you would for typical plumbing.
Yeah.
But now is the time to do it, right? When you're building the building is the time to do it, because if you don't do it now, you're never going to put it in later. And the calculations for the sizes of those tanks and what the demand will be for various things is pretty straightforward. And there are lots of companies out there that'll help you with it. So I think right now is the time to do it. Also, you know, if there are situations where you're looking at doing it on a campus scale or a neighborhood scale, like Boynton Yards, now is the time to make sure that that infrastructure gets in place, so that if water is coming from a community cistern back to individual buildings, we need that non-potable water piping in the street to get back to those buildings. That's a bigger push. That's a bigger challenge.
How do I find that company that does it? Because
and basically any of the rainwater tank companies will do the calculations for you for free.
Okay.
And I can reach out to you afterwards with a company that I've worked with. It's so
because the time is definitely now, you know. So
yep, absolutely.
well, thank you.
So the next pedal is the energy pedal. Sorry, I'm running a little bit behind schedule, but I'll try and keep up the pace a little. So they're similar to the water pedal. There are two imperatives in the energy pedal. One is the core imperative, which is the energy and carbon reduction. And that says that for new construction, you need to reduce your energy usage by 70% of site energy, no combustion on site, and 20% reduction in embodied carbon, which is the amount of carbon dioxide emitted or equivalent during the materials manufacturing and building construction phases. And that usually, you know, people don't pay a lot of attention to that, but that could be the equivalent of 10 to 20 years of building operations. And all of that is going out into the environment when the building is going up. And the current projections are that over the next 20 years, we're going to build the equivalent of New York City every 34 days. So we're talking about 20 years of New York City emissions being emitted every month for the next 20 years. So it's really substantial. So that embodied carbon reduction is honestly 20% is it's a pretty low bar, but because it's a fairly new goal that people are going after, it's a starting point, and we can go up from there. I will say the zero combustion on site, there are some exceptions to that. The most applicable for today's discussion would be for lab buildings, for specific equipment that requires very high heat at point locations like Bunsen burners. There is an exception for that because there is no alternative on the market that can accomplish what they need without combustion. When there becomes an alternative on the market, I expect that exception will go away, but for now, you're good to go with Bunsen burners and that type of lab equipment. The other imperative in the energy pedal is the net positive carbon imperative, and that's what's required to certify the energy pedal. And that requires that you are producing 105% of your annual energy usage on site. through PV or wind or some other renewable method that is not emitting CO2 into the environment. So this energy pedal right here is, oh, sorry, the net positive carbon also requires a one-time payment to offset the embodied carbon of the building. So you reduce the embodied carbon as much as possible. And then at the end, you pay for carbon offsets to offset what you couldn't reduce. So this energy pedal is essentially the zero carbon building certification that the ILFI also offers. I bring that up because the current the current Somerville zoning has the zero carbon building certification as an alternate compliance path to passive house for non-lab buildings in master plan overlay districts. So basically, where the zoning would require passive house, you can also do the zero carbon certification, which is a 100% offset of your, or 100% renewable energy and offsetting your embodied carbon. The zero carbon certification also allows hand printing, which is what the Institute calls when you offset your footprint, but you can do it off-site. So, so a project that doesn't have enough roof area to generate all of their electricity on site could find another location where they could put enough solar panels to offset their energy usage. So for example, the Winter Hill School does not have solar panels on the roof currently. They could pay to put solar panels on the roof of the Winter Hill School to offset their carbon footprint of the building operations energy. That is not required to be local, but obviously it's preferred. It does have to be new energy generation specifically for the project. So you cannot achieve the zero carbon certification just through purchase of renewable energy credits. You have to build a new renewable energy, or you can pay into a fund that, or pay into an organization that's building a new renewable energy sources, as long as they are dedicating a portion of that specifically for your project.
Just to clarify on that point. So
Yep.
if they were to, let's say, you know, someone wants to do this and they say, okay, we're going to put solar panels on the Winter Hill School. Does that mean that those solar panels on Winter Hill could only be used for the energy use of their building?
Do you mean who pays for who's getting the money savings from the electricity that's generated?
Yeah. Or,
So, I mean, it's all going into the grid, right?
Yeah,
At the end of the day, it's all going into the grid. They're not going to be running wires from the Winter Hill School specifically to their project. But as far as who is getting the savings from that electricity reduction,
yeah.
that is, I think, a developer agreement with wherever they're putting the solar panels. And, you know, preferably they would give that discount to the school, and then the school could invest that savings in other sustainability measures and education on sustainable practices. But that is not specifically prescribed.
Okay, thanks.
The health and happiness pedal. So this is getting back to what we were talking about prioritizing people, right? And creating an indoor environment that is beneficial to the health of the building occupants. And so the first imperative is the core imperative, which is the healthy indoor interior environment. And that basically means that you are designing the project to meet certain ASHRAE standards for indoor air quality, and providing 70% or 75% of occupants with access to views to the outside. The healthy interior performance is taking that a step further and requires indoor air quality testing to confirm that it is actually accomplishing that. There's also a variety of requirements about the VOC content of the materials that are going into the space and how to deal with all that. And then the access to nature is exactly what it sounds like. It's about giving people access to nature in their interior environment. And we'll come back to those ideas a little bit later when we get to the biophilia side of things. But basically this idea of connecting people with nature, we know has, I think, a 10 to 15% increase in productivity, has increase in student test scores, reduces crime in the neighborhood, certain smells relax people, natural smells like the smell of summer, because summer does actually scientifically have a smell, and it helps people relax. So there are all these things that are about creating an indoor environment that is beneficial to the building occupants and also beneficial to the building owners, because it's increasing the value of those spaces. And that sort of comes into the materials pedal. And so this is a big one. This is one of the more commonly certified pedals of projects that are out there. It's also one of the harder ones, but I think it has a lot of value to developers along the same lines as what we just talked about. So the core imperative is called responsible materials, and it's sort of a mismatch of all the rest to a lesser degree. So it requires that 50% of the wood be FSC, 20% of the materials in the building need to come from within 500 kilometers of the project site to support the local economy. It needs to use one Declare labeled product, and we'll talk about Declare on the next slide as well, and one Living Product Challenge certified product, which is one of the ILFI's other programs that takes these same 7 pedals and looks at how we can achieve positive products through their place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity, and beauty. And so what does it mean for, a piece of carpet to have a positive impact in all those same categories, or a piece of drywall, or a piece of data cable, right? All these things that we don't necessarily think about as being glamorous parts of a building, they all add up. And so if we can make those positive products, it helps make a positive building. And so you're required to have one Living Product Challenge certified product, and you have to divert 80% of your building waste from landfill. So that's the core imperative for materials. So all projects would have to accomplish that. To certify the pedal, there are these other ones. And so the first one is the red list. And the red list is a list of 15 chemical categories of chemicals that the Institute considers either harmful or probably harmful. And rather than identifying individual chemicals and just prohibiting an individual chemical, they're prohibiting the entire chemical class. And the reasoning for that is that what happens a lot is we discover that a chemical is harmful, and then the industry says, okay, we won't use that one anymore. And they find another one that is very similar. And then a few years later, we find out that one's harmful too, right? So for example, BPA used to be in all plastic water bottles, right? And I don't know if you all remember, but many years ago, it was discovered that BPA causes cancer and it shouldn't be in water bottles. BPA was not in water bottles to give people cancer. It was in because it makes plastic rigid, and that's something we look for in water bottles. So when they took the BPA out of water bottles, they needed to replace it with something. So they replaced it with BPS. 2 years later, we determined that BPS also causes cancer. So rather than, playing this whack-a-mole game of chemicals, they basically said, we're just going to eliminate all BPA and BPS chemicals and similar chemicals with a similar chemical structure. And to give you a sense of the scale of this, the EPA currently lists somewhere around 80,000 chemicals, and they have tested, I believe, around 600 of them for human health effects. And of those 600, they have restricted less than 10. One of the restricted chemicals is asbestos. Asbestos is not illegal in the United States. It is still used. It is used in the manufacture of chlorine, which goes into all our vinyl products. And the communities around the chlorine plants in Louisiana have the highest rate of cancer in the country. So when we put vinyl into our projects, when we use vinyl flooring or vinyl piping, PVC, right? There are effects of that on communities right now that is making them sick. So the red list is not just looking at what the effects are on building occupants, because PVC, once it's in your building, is not really going to affect your building occupants. What it will affect is it affects the communities around the manufacturing plants, and it affects firefighters who have to go in when that PVC is on fire. So the red list is looking at this whole range and trying to eliminate all of the chemicals that could cause concern. And they update it annually. Right now, if you're in the building industry, you may have heard about the PFAS chemical group, which is currently getting a lot of notice. Harvard has recently eliminated it from all of its building projects. It has a lot of bad endocrine and hormone disruptors. It's bad for reproductive systems. They're bad things. Those were not entirely on the red list. They are now on the list for inclusion, and I expect that they will be added to the red list, all 4,700 chemical ID numbers, probably next January. So this is regularly updated. The red list imperative says that you need to eliminate all red list chemicals from 90% of your building products. And that's a pretty tall order. It's hard, partly because a lot of that information is not necessarily easily available. A lot of manufacturers do not like sharing what is in their products because it's their secret proprietary ingredients. And so that is why the Institute came up with their declare label. And we'll talk about that more in a second. And I'll come back to that. So the responsible sourcing imperative says that 80% of the wood in the building needs to be FS certified, and the remaining 20% needs to be either from a low risk source or FSC certified. You need to use 2 declare labels per 200 square meter, per 2,000 square feet of project, and 1 living product challenge certified product per 10,000 square feet of building area. Living economy sourcing says that builds on the 20% of building products that have to come from within 500 kilometers, and says that another 30% of building products need to come from within 1,000 kilometers. Another 25% need to come from within 5,000 kilometers, and the last 25% of building products can come from any distance. And that's really to support the local economy and not just import everything from all over the world where it's not involved in the building construction. And then the last one is the net positive waste imperative, which is about not just diverting from landfill, although it does require very high levels of waste diversion for specific categories. So you have to divert 80% of your general commingle waste, but you have to divert, I think, 99% of metal, 99% of wood, 99% of paper, and maybe 100% of compostable waste during construction. The other requirement of the net positive waste is you have to incorporate 1 salvaged material per 5,000 square feet of building. And the idea there is that we're not just trying to take our waste and make sure it doesn't end up in a landfill. We want to absorb waste from other projects so that they are not going to landfill either. That we can be part of this reuse cycle so that we are starting to work towards that circular economy. And so just to jump back to the declare label, this is what a declare label looks like. And this is how the Institute approached this question of how do we keep red list products out of buildings if we don't know what the ingredients in these products are. So declare labels require that the ingredients are declared down to 100 parts per million, and There are a few exceptions. So you can see here at the bottom, the top one is LBC red list free. And that means that it's fully declared down to 100 parts per million and there are no red list chemicals in it. The next one is LBC compliant, which means that it takes advantage of one of a few exceptions. The one here is a proprietary ingredients exception, which basically says that if there's a proprietary ingredient that the manufacturer does not want to disclose that is less than 1% by weight of the product, and they promise it's not a red list ingredient, they can keep it undisclosed and still meet the requirement for LBC. The other things that are on here that you'll see are end of life options, how much of it is recyclable and how much of it goes to landfill when the product is taken out of the building at the end of its life, and its place of final assembly. And they are working on a new pilot that will also include the embodied carbon footprint of the product as well. So that's the declare label. So the equity pedal. The equity pedal has two imperatives. Both imperatives in this one are core imperatives, because the Institute recognizes that equity and inclusion are not secondary to ecology. We cannot forego equity in order to accomplish sustainability, because it is not sustainable if it is not equitable. So the first imperative is the universal access imperative, and that has a couple parts to it. The first one is that all public spaces of the building need to be universally accessible to everyone, regardless of their background, socioeconomic status, including the homeless. So if you think about how we discriminate against homeless people in our public spaces, none of that is allowed, regardless of age, physical or mental ability. It's not just about being ADA compliant, it's about recognizing that we want to make a space that's accessible to everyone. The other part of universal access is any project that is on a public waterway needs to provide public access to that waterway. And then the inclusion imperative requires that a certain number of the project team members have a just label, which is one of the Institute's other transparency labels for organizations. And this is what a just label looks like. So this is a way for organizations to show how they are doing in terms of diversity and equity and stewardship to their community. And so you can see there are 20 indicators that range from 1 to 4 points. And the goal of this is really for organizations to be transparent about where they are. It would be great if all organizations got 4 points on everything, but that is not the expectation, at least for now, right? The expectation is we want to be transparent. We want to recognize where the weaknesses are, and then we can work on improving them. The beauty pedal also has 2 core imperatives in it. The first is beauty and biophilia, and that goes back to what we were talking about previously about interior environment, right? And the advantages of having biophilic elements. And biophilia is not just about putting plants inside your building, although plants inside your building are great. It's also about providing views to nature. It's about incorporating natural elements, natural patterns like wood grain or wood texture, stone, creating elements of prospecting refuge where people can feel protected while surveilling their surroundings, right? Could be a little overlook where someone can see what's going on around them, but they still feel protected. And this is something that's evolved into our human nature to feel safe. Aspects of play of light and shadow, natural, similar to the light coming through the trees or the veins on a leaf, or all these things are natural elements, natural patterns, natural ideas that we've evolved around and make us feel comfortable. They help our health, they help our productivity. And it goes far beyond just putting plants inside. And then education and inspiration is the last imperative, where we're almost at the end. And that one is really about taking everything that you've learned from going through this project and sharing it with the world and showcasing it, because it was a lot of work to get there. And we want to, one, show all the work that you did so that you can get recognized for it, but also to help other project teams learn from it, right? Show other people that they can accomplish these things too. We want to spread these ideas so that it's not just one building that's getting living certified, it's all buildings that are getting living certified. Right? And those come in all forms. So they come from a single family house to a small community center to Google's new headquarters in London. And in all environments, multiple typologies like we talked about. So here you can see, right, this down here on the bottom is Google's new headquarters in London. This here on the left is the Etsy headquarters in New York. This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle. So they're really all over the place, from desert to tundra. If you are interested in this, you can further the process yourself as well. You can become a member of ILFI. You can also get registered to become Living Future accredited. Oh, sorry, you can be registered to get a Living Future accreditation like I have, or do these presentations. And there are multiple different tracks for registering building projects, but they all generally follow this same process, which is first you register and there's a certain billing cycle, and project certification costs are based on square footage. It's all online. It's pretty straightforward. And ILFI also provides certain consulting services to project teams. When you register for certification, you will automatically get a coach basically from ILFI who will help you through the process. And they also offer additional consulting services for project teams. If you become a Living Future member, you get discounts on their conferences and on certain education on their website, as well as to some of their Ecotone Publishing, which is their book publishing organization. If you want to register to be a Living Future accredited professional, if anyone on the call is already a green building certified professional in some other way, LEED or Passive House or any of those, there's a fast track for this as well. And once you're a Living Future accredited professional, you can become an ambassador like me and give these presentations to other folks. This is their Ecotone Publishing, which is their publishing branch. They have a whole range of books on sustainability in general, as well as all their programs and how projects are accomplishing them. That's it.
That's awesome.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Jake.
Do you,
any other questions?
I'm curious if you, I mean, do you have a goal of designing one of these buildings?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to work on a fully living certified project. I have a landscape and infrastructure project that I'm working on right now down on Cape Cod that is going after core green building certification. And that's partly because it came across the certification process a little bit late in the design process. But yes, I would love to work on one of these. I didn't mention it. There is a requirement that all projects, I think it's in the education imperative, all projects need to have a Living Future accredited professional on their project team somehow. So I could serve in that capacity, but yeah, we would love to be involved in any projects that are interested in going after any of this, and either as an architect for the project or just as an advisor to try and usher the project along.
So, thank you, Jacob.
Yeah.
So how do what would you recommend the process be to approach developers and say, here's what we want you to think about, and here are the next steps you need to take in order to do this? Like, what to you would that pitch sound like? And, you know, on the other slide, a couple of slides previous, I know there was a few of these bullet points. But like after we pitch it to them, where do we send them?
Yeah, so you can send them to me, or you can send them to ILFI. There's a various number of folks there.
So I could say, like, we might have an interested developer. Haven't reached out to him. Do you guys know Rafi? He does the he owns the Ames complex. Right now he's working on a project on Somerville Ave. I think it's reaching its first or second neighborhood meeting, so it might be a little late in the game. But if I were to come, like, be like, hey, Rafi, like, I think you've heard of this, and would you reach out to Jacob Bloom to learn more about it and to see if you can get any of the pedals? Like, is that a...
So yeah, you can certainly send them to me. You can also send him to, I mean, if he wants to do some more research, you can send him to the website, living-future.org.
Yep.
Is a good resource just to, I mean, if he just wants to have a conversation, I'm happy to have a conversation about it. If, in my experience, developers like to do a little bit more research on their own before they start engaging in those conversations. So if that's something that he wants to do, he can certainly go to living-future.org, which is the ILFI website. And there's a ton of information there, as well as a lot of contacts there if he wants to reach out to them directly.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if we, like that, when you're talking about the incentives to developers, right? It's really what we were talking about back here of, you know, performance is that there are people who performance is a really big driver, that they want to be green because they want to say that they've accomplished that. But I think that the industry recognition part is, for a lot of folks, a really big deal. And that is why you're seeing, you know, companies like Microsoft and Google and Boston Properties, for a more local developer, Boston Properties has a very aggressive sustainability agenda as well. And it's about developing their reputation. I mean, even Amazon has like a pretty aggressive sustainability agenda now. And it's about trying to maintain a reputation to the public that this is, that they're good people, that they're a good company. And this is one way that they do that. And that also has value to their tenants, who want to be able to say to their shareholders that, look, they also care about the environment, and that's why they're renting in this very sustainable building. Right. Along with the fact that it, you know, is keeping their employees healthier, and that's making them more productive, and all these other things. It's helping their bottom line.
So Jacob, I have it might be a series of questions. I don't want to run on, but just an observation about the Living Community Challenge.
Yeah.
I guess by nature, whether it's LEED or you know, the Living Community Challenge, Living Building Challenge, these certification programs, I mean, they're kind of geared, the real audience are developers or single property owners. When I think of a living community, I think of a neighborhood or a commercial district. I mean, in Somerville, we're blessed with a lot of such places. Not only Davis and Union, we have a lot of smaller squares, Magoon, Ball Square, Teal Square. You know, there's any number of them. Has any thought ever been given, rather than under the Living Community Challenge umbrella, to how would you programmatically create a certification system for like multiple property owners in an existing district, who could be enlightened in and of themselves, or could be convinced by neighbors to follow the path and certify their own buildings, but in the spirit of trying to certify an entire district, and get the branding claim on that. That is what the focus for the moment is. on individual owners and developers. It seems like the Living Community Challenge can almost really only work in greenfield sites or large redevelopment sites where you have a master developer, like Boynton Yards, like you mentioned, or Assembly Row, or at corporate headquarters for Amazon or Google or someone who has tremendous power and capital to completely transform a place. But what if it was done a little more incrementally? You know, again, with the set of smaller property owners in a neighborhood or a commercial mixed kind of use district, or a business district. And again, the selling point being similar to what you've said the selling points are now. It's sort of the branding thing, being able to claim we've got the certification. Has there, as far as you can tell, has the organization given much thought to how to approach that at a community scale? And in terms of just of like retroactive, adaptive regeneration in existing districts, as opposed to completely new greenfield, or wiping the slate, on an existing brownfield site or something like we.
Yeah. So I don't know all of it off the top of my head. Similar to the way that the Living Building Challenge has multiple typologies for new construction versus existing, the Living Community Challenge also has two typologies for a new master plan versus an existing neighborhood. I don't know off the top of my head how they treat those differences. I would need to dig into that a little bit more. I know as far as
you're saying there is an actual typology.
There is a typology for existing neighborhoods. I do not know how it approaches it. Though I would need to dig more into that.
Would there be any way to follow up with you to see if there actually have been any real world examples yet?
So I can tell you that there are probably not any that are complete, because of the Living Community Challenge projects that are out there. I just learned about one. So the Living Community Challenge, I think, it officially got released in 2014. And I know of one project that's currently in the implementation phase of it, that the project started in 1996. So, right, building a neighborhood takes a long time. So there are not going to be any that are complete. I can look and see. So the First Hill neighborhood in Seattle is one that pops to mind, but I don't know. It was a pretty extensive master planning approach they took there, but that is an existing neighborhood. There's a whole case study on it. I can dig that out and send that to you if you put your contact info in the sign-in sheet. But I don't know off the top of my head how the existing approach varies from the new construction. That being said, as far as getting shareholders on board, it is certainly easier when there's either a policy requirement through the zoning or master planning that was pushed for by the community. I think in the First Hill neighborhood, I think that it was predominantly community driven. That being said, ILFI is headquartered in Seattle. Seattle has always been sort of one of the leaders in these programs because of that. But I think the community really pushed for that approach in that neighborhood. The biggest case, I think, where you could really see it implemented is probably higher ed campuses, where you have a single owner who is already invested in sustainability because they're higher ed, and that is how higher ed works. And they have a neighborhood that they own and they can do what they want with, and is, for most higher ed institutions, constantly under construction and being reworked anyway.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I would agree with you there.
So that being said, I don't actually know of any higher ed institutions that are pursuing the Living Community Challenge as part of that. There are, I think Williams has a Living Building Challenge certified building, but they're not doing any campus-wide projects that I know of. Also keep in mind that the Living Community Challenge does not require all the buildings to be Living Building certified, right? It's about creating a positive campus or positive neighborhood. It's not about the individual buildings anymore. So public buildings do need to be Living Building certified, but the overall neighborhood, not all the buildings do, as long as it meets the requirements as a whole. And for the Living Community Challenge, it's much looser because there is no way of creating this sort of perfect framework that every neighborhood is going to fit into. So that's why there's a whole visioning phase and then a master planning phase and then an implementation phase where essentially you're creating, working with ILFI, what the framework that you're trying to accomplish for this neighborhood is.
Okay, thanks for that response. Very good, I appreciate it.
Can I ask, can you hear me okay if I speak through Bill's computer over on the other side of the room?
Yep.
Great. Okay, way better than me being off mute and having my voice bounce back. I have so many questions, but maybe I'll start with maybe going back to just thinking about what Troy, you had mentioned about the RAPI project. And if I'm thinking of which project it is, it's the one down in Somerville Lab that we were talking about recently up on Belmont Street. Yeah. And so I know part of that dialogue was also about who the tenants would be. And so I'm curious what, and like we're gonna have a building here, what do we even want it to be or the community for it to be? And so I'm curious about in what ways like the living building stuff also weaves in like the tenant focus as part of outcomes. So like for instance, one of the things I feel like would be amazing what Somerville did, especially in this moment where there's so much development happening, would support with the embodied energy and making sure materials stay as close to home and are used as close to home. There's a reuse center in Boston. Wouldn't it be amazing to have something like that here? And not that the RAPI project, maybe that's not the most appropriate place for that, but something like the reuse center. So the use of that space is in itself contributing community-wise to a more sustainable environment and community. So I guess I'm curious about so maybe it's a two-part thing, the tent, so sort of that way. And then I'm also curious about living building stuff with thinking almost like smaller single or simple use structures, like even something as simple as we're putting in a athletic field or whatever, and we want to like build some sort of like structure for toilets or something. Like
sheds are great. They're
right, yeah, like
right, very low energy use for a shed.
Yeah, like what if the city just committed to on all public, spaces, everything's gonna be living building certified that are sort of these smaller single use. It's just where people are gonna go to the bathroom, but we commit to compost toilets, we commit to green, and even on those sort of tiny, anyway, so I'm just curious in what way, so that's sort of a two-pronged thing. I have more questions.
So I guess for the tenant question, there are a couple things there. So one of developers' concerns often is a lot of these things that we're talking about are about the tenants, right? That if you're the developer and you're making a lab building and then you're going to rent it out to tenants who are going to come in, how do you know that they're going to meet your energy usage requirements, right? And that's fair. And so a lot of this, there's a whole green leasing is a whole thing. And I am certainly not an expert on it, but there are ways of incorporating into the lease documents to incentivize the tenants to meet your goals with you, right? And hopefully if they're renting from a project that's getting living building certified, they're doing that for a reason, and they have the same goals that you do and they want to accomplish the same things. And so it builds in that, each tenant has an energy quota that they cannot exceed, or then they start paying a surplus costs on their energy usage if they pass that threshold or something like that. So that's part of it. What was the other part of the tenant question?
Well, I guess it's also just incentivizing, like, in what way, because eventually I'm thinking about in terms of that. So for instance, there's this dialogue that's happening in this particular project that Tori mentioned that is about like, what do we want to have here? Like, so it's not that the tenants are even, the building hasn't even been decided who's going to be there yet, and the building hasn't been built, you know? So in what ways can the type of tenancy or the use of the building? So the example I gave is like a reuse center.
Oh, I
The
see.
actual use of the building is in itself something that supports hopefully sustainably, you know, just and healthy.
Yeah. So as far as, are you talking about Boston Building Resources?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that that's a little bit different, but
Yeah. So I don't actually know what their current status with their current location is, but as far as attracting, you know, sustainable organizations or into the project, I mean, I think that's sort of something that has to come from the developer. And I mean, the concern there is, you know, Somerville land is not cheap. And so convincing them to choose their tenants based on that could be a challenge. I don't know. It depends. But I think that regardless, so obviously it would be great to bring in spaces that are beneficial to the community beyond just the building itself, right? And that could be in the form of community spaces, right? Maybe there are meeting rooms that in off hours get used for community events, right? When the building isn't being used by the primary tenant or something like that. But I don't know if, or maybe, you know, the ground floor of the building is some sort of small local retailers or something like that. So it's supporting the local economy that way. As a building as a whole, I don't know. I mean, it really comes down to the developer's pro forma and what tenant they think is going to make them the most money there. And I don't know if you're going to have a lot of luck trying to sway them on what is going to make them the most money in that location. But I think that regardless of the program that ends up there, who the tenant or what the tenant is doing from an occupation standpoint, that you can find the tenants who do care about the sustainability side of it and are willing to pay for the sustainability side of it because they understand the returns to their business. And then, yeah, in terms of, you know, getting the city to commit to when they build a certain project type that they're going to follow these standards, that would be great. I don't know who the person is to convince that they need to do that.
Yeah, like housing of work, like I don't know where all the lawnmowers are for this, you know, just like buildings that are housing things that don't need to be temperature or whatever, and don't even need toilets in them, and could be, you know, and so could those buildings in some respects, you know, sort of, or I gave the example of like if you had an athletic facility and there was, you know, toilets or something in you said like a shed structure, but just thinking about.
So I will say this is, so we didn't get into it today. ILFI does have a different method of certification that they call their volume certification, which basically it's a little bit higher upfront certification costs, but what organizations do is they work directly with ILFI to basically create a guidebook on how to build something that is more or less pre-certified, or at least it's like 3/4 of the way there, and then they have to do the performance stuff at the end. You see it much more with companies like Salesforce, which is volume certified all their interior fit outs for their offices. So they work with ILFI so that basically they have a book that whenever they fit out a new office, they follow this book, and then they go to ILFI and they say, here, we did our project. And ILFI says, check, yay, you're good. So that's less common for small projects, but you could, you know, if that was something the city was interested in, they could potentially say, you know, like every time we want to come up with a volume certification for our public restroom sheds or something like that, and they come up with a framework to do that.
So it's
because
like a
yeah.
programmatic approach, right, Jacob? It's like, when we commit to when we build these types of facilities under our jurisdiction, we will do it under these set of guidelines that are certified.
Right, basically. And there's still some there, because it's a performance-based certification, there is still some auditing that has to happen at the end. But it gets rid of a lot of the upfront certification paperwork by doing that. But because it's customized to the specific project, there is a more upfront cost on the certification side in order to help work with ILFI to write that guidebook. So it really only works if you're doing a lot of them.
Yeah. Okay. Or I guess I'd be curious, and not that you necessarily have to respond to this now or anything, but just thinking again about other municipalities, or if there are other communities that are doing something like that for multiple structures. If that even lives somewhere with ILFI, you know what I mean? Like in this city, there's their guidebook for all of their public restrooms. In this other place, here's their guidebook that they're using for whenever they do this, you know? And
Yeah.
people are able to
I don't,
but
not that I know of.
happy as many yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's that the volume certification path has been out for maybe 3 or 4 years now, so it's a little bit newer. So there are not a ton of examples of it out there yet.
I won't keep you guys much longer, but this is so fascinating. So I saw on one of the city councilor agendas that they want to do a public restroom in Davis and one in Union Square. Could we get a public restroom to be certified? ILFI or?
Yeah, so you can certify anything. Anything is possible. I don't want to like, I'm not going to say anything's off limits. To do it, you would probably need to use composting toilets.
Yep.
I think that is, I mean, we if we really wanted to dig into this, we could go further, but off the top of my head, I think composting toilets are most likely the way to go. And then you would need, the biggest question is if the state would let you use non-potable water for hand washing.
Oh.
Unless you use like antibacterial, Purell instead of sinks, which, for a public toilet, you might be able to do, but it would be better if we didn't have to do that, because antibacterial stuff is actually on the red list. Antibacterials are a red list category and they're also one of the, I don't know if you guys know the 6 classes website. 6 classes is another one that basically has identified 6 classes of chemicals that are bad instead of the 15 that are on the red list. So we try and stay away from antibacterials because they usually cause more damage than they help. That being said, hand washing does not need to be potable water. You're not drinking it, but it would require some working with the state plumbing board to get it approved. And you'd certainly need a sign next to the sink that said, "Do not drink this water, it's not potable," or something like that. Putting a sign there that says that is not hard though. Frankly, like when you go to California, it's everywhere because California has a water shortage and is aware of this problem. So it would be doable.
So
yeah.
Would the water be like roof collected, or?
Yeah, you would collect rainwater. You would, my guess is if the state plumbing board let you do it, you would still need to process the water. So it would need, you'd need to collect the water and you would need to clean it and probably run it through some sort of UV filtration system at least.
Yeah.
Because despite the fact that you're not drinking it, it still needs to be clean.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to not have bacteria in it.
Yep.
And then to run those systems, you probably also need solar panels on the roof to run it. So like it builds, but you're trying to create essentially a self-contained ecosystem. And so that's how you have to think about it. Of like, we have this ecosystem bubble, what needs to come into the bubble and what comes out of the bubble so that it can all stay together, right? And the goal is that the only things that go into the bubble are sunlight and rain and people. And what comes out of the bubble is nutrients to feed plants, right? That's the goal. And water. And people. People come out too. They don't just go in.
Thank
Can I
you
raise-
so much. Oh,
Oh, you're back on.
Jacob, how are you on time?
I'm fine. I mean, if we don't have any more questions, I'm good to end, but if there are more questions, I can take a few more, that's fine.
Well, I was wondering if these are less questions, and I think just one is actually a follow-up to a question I asked you when you presented to the Union Square Neighborhood Council.
Mhm.
So it's more, I guess, comment or as opposed to direct questions or maybe recommendations or something. But you had mentioned about the education and inspiration, and I think when I asked at the Union Square Neighborhood Council meeting, I was like, oh, like what exactly does that look like in terms of education? Like thinking about if we've certified our building or our community, et cetera, what am I then, committing to in terms of the disseminating and the teaching and being available, right, and accessible to people who are struggling or going through it. And I appreciate that it's not, you didn't write it, so you were just sharing what the thing was. And I'm not gonna lie, that what you shared to me was like kind of underwhelming in terms of like, it was about people could come, they have to do a tour once a year with some sort of simple things like that. And I was like, oh, I mean, that's something. And I guess it's just the same time, I'm curious. I don't know. I just so you know, my kind of like, it felt underwhelming in terms of what that requirement is or what that commitment is for people. I mean, I think about things like mentorship, like somebody being available and I don't know in what way ILFI would then help facilitate that process. Clearly, you're all available as consultants to see people through a process, but having even if it's not a requirement, if that could be a part of the education inspiration where people can step into that role and make them and say, I commit to, if there's another project that's similar somewhere else in the country and they want to call me up and over 6 months, I could come back to mentor, a mentor to somebody through it. I'm happy to, do that. I guess, anyway, so I'm curious what ways that could be, expanded on.
So I will say, so it's not a requirement, but from what I have seen of projects that are certified, the people behind them are so proud of their projects that they will talk to absolutely anyone about them, right? Like there was a lot of work that went into those projects, and if you'll listen, they will talk to you about them without any question, right? You've never seen someone so excited to show you their composting toilet, right? It's like, this is not easy. This is a challenge, right? And they went through it, and those that have made it through are really, really proud of what they've accomplished. And the requirement is, a tour once a year, but the Bullet Center, well, not right now, but they do tours, I think weekly before the pandemic, maybe monthly, but they do tours very often, and they go through the entire building. They go down and they look at the composting toilets and the gray water recovery system. They go up on the roof and they look at the solar panels. They go through the building and they look at the way that they've designed the stair. They call it their irresistible stair, right? To try and encourage people to take the stairs rather than the elevator, both for occupant health and energy reduction. And so they go through all these things, and it's because that, if you commit to this, if you go through it, you believe in it, and the education requirement is the minimum, but but once you've committed to this, you've committed to it, right? Like you believe in it. Otherwise you wouldn't have put all the energy into doing it in the first place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And this is, so this picture on the screen right here is the Candida building at Georgia Tech, which just got living certified this past year sometime. And like there is so much about this building they would love to tell you about. I don't know, well, right now I don't think they're doing any open tours, but like, you know, they have done so many video tours of this that, and if you called them, I bet they would just talk to you and talk because they love this project.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. The only other thing was, again, that also just came to mind. This just comes to mind, and I feel like it's something a lot of spaces I'm in, I'm always asking about, again, think about like sort of untapped resources. And a lot of times people don't talk about faith communities in a lot of this work, and they own a lot of land all over this country, the world. And I think about some of the more like progressive faiths, like Unitarian Universalism or the UCC. So anyways, I guess I'm just like, oh my gosh, I would love to like connect you with like the people at the UUA.
Let's do it.
Boston, which is here, and so to be able to give a presentation to congregations who would sign on and commit, since they're already so deeply committed to, as part of their 7 principles, you know what I mean, to interconnectedness and sustainability and social justice. So I just am like, anyways, I just think about that houses of worship as a space to that people don't necessarily think of, but you're also then reaching, 500 congregations at once, sort of thing, that sort of stuff. So
I mean, one place to start, right? Like obviously if they're building something, like let's go all out, let's build a living building. But if they're not, right, there are still steps they can start to take, right? They can still get, maybe just for one location, or maybe they start to expand it, and maybe, I don't actually know how interconnected all the Unitarian Universalist churches throughout the country and the world are, but like that would be incredible if they all decided to get a just label and start to recognize what the gender and ethnic diversity within their organization is, and how they are supporting their local communities or animal welfare, right? Like how committed are they in their purchasing to an equitable supply chain, right? These are things that are, I'm not saying that the just label is like the be all end all of what makes a socially just organization, because there's too much there to put on one little card, but it's a really good starting point to sort of assess where you are as an organization from a social justice standpoint and where you can do better. So that would be, for an organization like that, I think this could be a really interesting starting point for the conversation as well. But absolutely, I'd be happy to talk to them about the Living Building Challenge for their next building or renovation or any of that too. But
yeah, I'll look into it, only because I'm connected to them. So
okay, great.
Yeah, thank you for fielding all of this.
Absolutely.
And to everyone for listening.
All right, guys. Thank you so much, Jacob. This was amazing.
Good. I'm glad everybody learned something. I know that this was a little bit more in depth than the first time around. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, excellent. Definitely wanted to do a deep dive, or
right.
Deeper.
Deeper, yeah.
Looking to go even deeper. So
well, and I will say, I'm happy to talk more about any of this, but there's also a bunch of educational resources online. If you're interested in, if you go to the website, there's a whole education section, which they have their foundations curriculum, which it's 20 hours of education on their fundamental programs. Living Building Challenge, I think, has one 4-hour course or something like that, where they go through all the imperatives individually and actually identify the requirements for each and every imperative, and go through in a lot more detail than we did today. But there are also tons of courses about all their other programs and a bunch of other stuff too. So it could be, and as well as the Living Community Challenge if you want to learn more about that. So.
Do you know offhand how much it costs to be certified? Just thinking about asks, we can be like, so-and-so developer, we want you to train Tori, Renee, and Lee, and Bill and Delphine, since you're all here.
So I don't.
I'll
I
look
don't
into
know.
it.
They changed their fee structure recently, and I don't actually know. There's, so most of the education that's required is through their online course system, which is on a pay by course basis. I don't know if there's an additional certification cost now, or if they're just having you pay for the education. I want to say the entire foundations course is somewhere around $600, but I don't remember. And then if there is a certification cost on top of that, it's maybe a couple $100. I don't know. I haven't done it in a little while. So, and then they also, I mean, certification aside, they also have an annual conference in April that you can sign up for. That one's, I mean, it's usually a 3-day conference. It used to always all be in person, but I think they've switched to a hybrid model now going forward. The past 2 years have been all virtual. And that's usually around $500 for the 3-day conference pass, which usually also, or at least the past couple of years, has included some number of replays of the presentations you missed and such. And that's always, I mean, that's not specifically towards certification. Sometimes there are courses that are part of the foundations course that are specifically targeted at ILFI programs, but a lot of it is looking at a broader context of energy, or this past year, there were a lot of it was about specific projects, especially Indigenous community projects that are going after certification. And this year they added an entire new Spanish language track to their conference. So it's a really broad spectrum of stuff. But the next one will be in April. They probably have other events coming up before that, but I don't actually know when they are. So, and they are working on developing a relationship with Built Environment Plus. I don't know if you guys are, well, Meredith, you guys know Meredith. Yeah. So Built Environment Plus, which used to be the USGBC Massachusetts, is going to be, I think, real tied to the local ILFI chapter, basically. But I don't know the current status of that. So, cool.